thing about me.
All right, here we go.
I'm talking to you.
Middle Ground Podcast. Episode 31 now. Man.
You're getting old.
I know, man. We're creeping up on it.
You're getting older. Yes, sir.
All right. What do we got? What do we got for the good people of Earth today?
Man, well, we're going to try and cut through the butter and get to the guns. And
Cut through the butter. But that's the best part,
hey,
man.
now.
I want my butter. It's the best part.
That's right.
How do you think you get this kind of figure
Without the
without
butter. That's true. Well, anyhow, the idea here is, and that's a good narrative.
Right?
You got,
Yeah.
and that's what we're going to talk about today, controlling the narrative.
Controlling the
who-
narrative, the power of narrative.
That's right. The who, the where, the why, the when. However, before we do that, I just want to inform Californians again about the PSR program. That's the Power Saving Rewards program that potentially California can save on their utility bill, and that's what we definitely need to do
'Cause I
nowadays.
just got smacked. Man, I just got smacked.
Yeah, definitely with this this heat, we're turning on the AC more often. However, this potential savings comes about during a flex alert, which you would get a notification. So you first want to sign up. There might be a QR code there, and you can sign up. Once you're signed up with your utility company, that could be PG&E, or if you're in the Southern California area, that's the Edison, and San Diego as well, their utility company. And you'll sign up with your utility company, and once you're signed up, you would get notified when there's a flex alert. They would do it the day before.
So I got it right now.
The day before, notifying you to reduce your power the next day. So between the hours of 4 and 9 p.m., they're asking Californians to reduce their power consumption. So you might maybe turn on your AC prior to 4 o'clock, or at least reduce the how cool you keep the house, maybe down to 78 or so between those times.
Asked me before I left, can I turn?
You can,
I mean, if you don't mind not eating this month, we can turn whatever you want.
you know what I'm saying? You know, eat out. Don't. So your wives
That's
will
right.
be happy.
No more DoorDash.
The women will be happy. But any which way you can reduce your power, you're helping Californians maybe stay from a brownout in your local area, and of course, you know, you're saving power. And the double whammy is that you would also get a credit on your utility bill. So for every kilowatt that you save, you get $1 back. So that does add up. Now, again, you're not forced to do this. Let's say you get a flex alert, but you need the power on
If your wife
your
gives
AC.
you that look.
Yeah, what? You're gonna turn off the AC? Are you joking me right now? Hey, we
right.
need to save $1, man. Yes, sir. So
Yes.
you don't have to. You don't.
don't have to.
Even though you sign up, you don't have to participate that particular day. And again, it's only during a flex alert that you would save on
it's
your
not all the
utility
time.
bill. It's not all the time. So anyhow, just wanted to bring that up. If you have any questions or concerns, you can leave a post and we'll try and answer that. But getting back to the show here, you're talking about the narrative and who is controlling the story. But what is a narrative anyways? I mean, we hear that a lot, kind of this common vernacular in the podcast scene or throughout.
What is it, man?
What is the narrative? The idea of the narrative, and at least controlling the narrative, the powers that be, is basically how they manage the flow of information, how it's presented on specific issues, and predominantly trying to influence public opinion and maintain a desired image or viewpoint.
Yeah.
So the idea, who does it?
Well, I think there's a narrative which can, of course, be a positive and a negative, but then there's also propaganda, right? And so, uh, and then there's propaganda that has tried to take on the form of narrative. So, what is narrative, right? Narrative is like telling a story, right? Which in itself is not necessarily something malicious or whatnot, right? In fact, you could say that the Quran, it tells much of the information that we get in the Quran is in a narrative format. Like we get the story of Ibrahim, alayhi salam. We get the story of Fir'aun, of Pharaoh. We get the story of this or that. And the difference between a narrative and, say, like a report is that the narrative is going to, according to the dictates of the author who is telling the story, they're going to tell you what they think you need to know about it. Now, I think in the modern context, there's been a slip towards the concept of narrative, like not really being true. So when you hear, for instance, like a story, the first thing when you conjure up the word story in your mind is that, oh, well, it's not true. So you can take a great amount of creative license with it, or it's not true. Whereas a story, there is an author to a story that is choosing to maybe highlight certain aspects over others, to remove certain aspects because they are maybe not quintessential. They're not necessarily quintessential to what the story is being told. So you take, for instance, in the 18th chapter, in the 18th chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf, there are many different vignettes that are given to us. So we have the vignette of the people of the two gardens, and then we have the people of the cave, and then later on we have a figure known as Dhul Qarnayn, and so on. And those are presented to us in a way where, for instance, like, well, where were the people in the so-called sleepers of the cave? Well, where was the cave? Where were they? How long ago was it? Those details are omitted in favor of other details. Or the people of the garden. One man had a garden, or two men had a garden. One was grateful, one was not. Well, what did it grow in the garden? Other friends of mine who are imams will laugh. People will say, Imam, I have a question. Sure, what's your question? What kind of dog was in the cave? Was it a German Shepherd? Was it a Cocker Spaniel? Was it a Corgi? Right? Now, we can laugh at that, but that Allah tells us that there's a dog in the cave, but doesn't mention, what kind of dog it was, how old was the dog, and on, and where'd they get the dog from, and was it a pure breed or a mutt? Those details are omitted because they're not important to the overall what Allah wants you to get from the story. They're not omitted due to lack of capability. And of course, this would be the difference between the narrative in the Quran and the narrative of a human being. A human being might fabricate or embellish a story because they don't have access to all of the facts. Where there are some other astounding facts that Allah does tell us about the sleepers in the cave, how many years that they slept, and on and on and on, right? Because by Allah leaving those details in, right, it's important to the story. But then there's propaganda, right, which I think also, sadly, the word propaganda has been subsumed under the sinister. Where, if you think about it, the root of the word in English is related to propagate, which is actually not a bad thing, right? Like if you want to have children, that's propagation. If you want to grow crops, that's propagation, right? So in and of itself, those are not necessarily blameworthy things. But of
Has
course,
a connotation.
right? Then siyaq, right? Like the context is extremely important. And so we've seen a shift, actually, in the way, especially in the social and political context, where now certain, say, political parties or participants are trying to make a narrative, right? They don't talk about policy anymore. What am I going to do when I get in office? You know, I'm just going to show you a montage of images that show me smiling or with this group of people or that group of people. I want you to have an emotional experience through this portrayal of images to you. Mm-hmm. And I don't want you to think about my policies whatsoever, because either I ain't got no policies, or the policies I have, they're not going to serve your interest. They're going to serve probably not even really my interest, so to speak. They're going to serve my master's interest. But, instead, I want to assuage your conscience and your intelligence along the way. And so, like narrative is very powerful, because if you don't know who you are, right, and we tend to know who we are. Walter Benjamin, who is an anthropologist, he wrote a lot about the power of story and narrative, and like how we come to formulate, like who are we? We come to, he said this is why even in the digital age, in the age of massive technological advances, one of the things that still remains critically important to human beings is stories, because that's how we form the very concept of who we are. So likewise, as Muslims, if you don't know who you are, somebody will be very happy to come along and make up your mind for you and tell you who you are.
Well, I wasn't going to bring up propaganda, but so this had been illegal for the government to produce propaganda. And I believe that was a bill, the Smith-Mundt Act or something like that, or a bill. And from what I heard, if you try to Google it, I don't think it comes up no longer. But Obama, I think, repealed that, allowing the American public to be propagandized. Oh, really? So that was an illegal thing to do. That was done as covert operations overseas to sway the public. The military might do that through their own means, however, or CIA. But that was illegal for many years for American citizens to be propagandized by the military. So when that repeal happened, which now is very hard to find that Obama did that. They tried to whitewash it or scrub it, but we've seen such a the stories that they can tell now and guide the public through the news media.
Right.
And you almost sometimes you would sit there and say, what are you guys talking about? That is absolutely absurd. There's no way that, right? I mean, you can just feel it, but like any good, news outlet, the more you can just keep saying it over and over and over, after a while, you just kind of believe that story that's being told.
What's weird is I gotta find it. Maybe we can put it up in the show notes later. But there's a great clip, and it like turned into not even just a meme, but like it became kind of viral. So I don't remember, like a couple years ago, there was like a kind of script that was given to like news anchors. And they were talking about like propaganda and such. But then, like every single news station
went up, and the next
was reading the exact same script, the exact same, verbatim, like word for word, and that showed like how media is an extension and is a utility of these powers. And so here you are thinking and it's funny because I don't know who it said. It said that's why they're called news anchors now. not journalists, but they're because they want to anchor you to something. They want to anchor you to a particular narrative, a particular propaganda. They want to make sure that you are beholden to that.
Yeah, and this isn't anything new, right? So, as you had mentioned in Quran, Allah had talked about the greatest, I would say, maybe controller of the narrative, which would be Pharaoh. And a quick verse, Allah reminds that these leaders or these factions and people in history, Allah says that we made them leaders, inviting others to the fire. I mean, ultimately, in summary, whatever their message was, whatever they're controlling, it was just leading people to the fire. Whatever their story was, I'm your God, I'm this or whatever, and all of their magic or bewilderment that they can control you with, it's ultimately taking you to the fire. And so on the day of judgment, they will not be helped. So that's Surah 28, verse 41. And it's a beautiful story of Musa, very detailed in explaining the social ramifications of what Bani Israel went through, and then how some were duped, some just couldn't, leave it alone. The people of Pharaoh were stuck in their whole thing, and that was kind of the idea that we had, is that, well, then are Muslims being consumed because they haven't really grounded themselves in their deen to a level where, you know what, I can see the story here. This ain't right. Rather, we're trying to fit our Islam into the narrative, the prevailing narrative, so we fit in or whatever.
Yeah, it's like there's a master narrative, and then there's narratives that are subsumed under that. And I think one of the easy examples of that is how Muslims have understood the American political landscape, or in many ways how they have not understood it, but they have understood it. They've understood it primarily in a wrong way of what running from one camp to the other. 1 minute we're going to be conservative. The next minute we're going to be liberal. 1 minute we're Republican. 1 minute we're Democrat. And
we got to join forces with this group,
right? The folly of that, of running back. But the more importantly, what has been driving us to flip from one group to the other, right? Is that it really demonstrates that far too many of us have been inoculated and have been made susceptible to a master narrative, and then Islam becomes the narrative that is subsumed in that some way possible. So whether that is, we're going to stand with Kamala Harris and pose with her and smile, even though she has played an important role and continues to pledge her support to the massacring of children and Muslims, and yet you're going to smile and stand with her because of the narratives that reign over yours of racial diversity or racial inclusion or black girl magic or whatever the nonsense is. No, I'm very serious, right? Like, because when I saw that a couple weeks ago, I was like, man, this is, and I knew the person, I knew their father from when I lived in Philadelphia. And I was like, man, there's no way that Imam Asim would approve of this. This is absolutely reprehensible that Muslims would openly smile and pose with people that are intimately involved in the killing of Muslims, Muslim children. I mean, just absolutely despicable.
Right.
But it begs the question, how and why? How did we get to this? Where did this come from? And I think, again, it shows the power of narrative.
Yeah.
So,
and the emotion. So who? We'll quickly just 4 points here of who does it. So governments do this to influence public opinion, manage crisis, and support political agendas. Political parties, of course, to sway their voters and whatnot, get their opinion across. Media organizations shape the narratives, right? Emphasize certain issues as opposed to others. Corporations build a brand or image or public relations in crisis or influence consumers' behavior. So these are just 4 dominant that we can see. The why, I think we kind of covered. However, one of the things sometimes we miss is to enhance reputation. And the more that the reputation can be relied on, the more we can swallow the narrative, right?
Yeah.
You trust more. And, this becomes tricky because once you've kind of given your proverbial allegiance,
Right.
when they kind of cross the line, you're caught in the middle like, well, but they're still okay. And you kind of justify the action there,
Yes.
and we're getting into this kind of realm. What I've always seen progressively is that it's bottle and hawk. You're either on this side of the fence of the truth or the falsehood, and it's time to take your pick. And Muslims are getting wrapped up in the okie doke. Many people are, and you try to cover your decision making, and it's not coverable. It's like either you're with that group or you're not.
Right.
So those are a couple of the other ancillary ideas. However, how they do it, and this becomes important. And if we just look into Quran, in the book, Allah describes many means of how the narrative is controlled and how people are controlled by the narrative.
Yeah.
And again, the epitome of that is Pharaoh, and his control was either by force, by the magical mystery of his technology,
Right.
And the environment, by the wealth, the allure of this whole empire, and I belong, this asabiya, I'm with this, this great empire, it's like everyone wants to come here and be with us, and we have all the food. I'm part of that. So you'll find, maybe some Americans feel good when outside other people from other countries, kind of praise America and how they are, in spite of what we do, and we feel good and comfortable with that.
Yeah,
we like that, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, in some ways, one of the greatest examples of narrative is that of American exceptionalism, right?
Exactly.
That idea that America is unique amongst the nations, has a unique destiny amongst the nations, is uniquely immune to the same ailments of other nations, and will somehow uniquely persist throughout history and evade destruction like other nations that came before it. So American exceptionalism is really, it's an extremely, not just powerful narrative, because I think you can probably find amongst any ethnic group, hey, we're the greatest, we're the best, that kind of thing. I don't think you'll find that. But I think there is something unique to American exceptionalism. One example is, and I was just reading this before, about there is an academic that wrote an article about examples of American exceptionalism right in the 20th century. So you have a couple examples would be how the American government dealt with, and the ideologues. So there's the government, and then there's the ideologues that are manipulating the levers of government, right? So you take, for instance, the Great Depression. There was a lot of narrative around that, and we're going to be resilient and get through this, right? But another great one, really, really great head job that they did on people, was actually the civil rights movement. So if you look at the civil rights movement, right, what was it? You had a group of, and it's funny, like, you don't say you had a group of Americans that fought against other Americans. So when it was like white people fighting each other in America, we call it the Civil War, right? But when black people, who were Americans, right, they may not have had all the rights, but they were definitely Americans, when they fought against their government, they were not portrayed as, freedom fighters or anything. They're just called blacks, right? But so you had African Americans in the 20th century that formulated a movement to fight against oppression and injustice. And as he writes, he's like, at the end of that, when they achieved their victory, the forces that be, the politicians, the government, and the ideologues, then took the victory that black folks achieved in the civil rights movement and spun it and said, well, of course, of course they won their freedom. Of course, America changed its policies towards African Americans, because that's what America does. It was just mere Americana. This was not the struggle of African Americans who many of them had to actually give their life. Some were assassinated and others were beaten to death and hung. And no. That was just the inevitable triumph of Americana.
Right.
And so they then took that, the valor of black people fighting against that. Right? They took all of that blood, sweat, and tears and sacrifice of black folks during that, and they spun it to like, well, of course. And now they will go around and preach to other countries around the world. You guys are so far behind us. Like, look at us. We change. We address our problem. So it's one of the great examples of where the line between narrative and propaganda becomes very blurred, right? It becomes very hard to, to perceive. And it's always, because it wants people to have, as there's a French, another French intellectual. But sadly, Americans don't seem to think much anymore. So, like I said,
leave it to the French.
The European, philosophers and academics and intellectuals, like I said, they have many great observations. They just have catastrophic conclusions of those observations. But right, like Paul Ricoeur, he talked about narrative, and that one of the things narrative wants you to do, it wants you to align yourself emotionally with a story. So why is it, like, you take this, what I just talked about with the civil rights movement and American exceptionalism, is that they want white people, they want non-Americans abroad, and they even want black people to identify with this co-opting of the narrative, or co-opting of the struggle into the new narrative of like, hey, you black people didn't do that. That was America that ultimately actually did that for you. Right? Because if you had tried to do that anywhere else in the world, you would have never been able to have done that. Even though black people weren't chattel slaves anywhere else in the world. Right? And so it's very insidious, right? And that's why if you go back to the verse, like that you mentioned in Surah Al-Qasas, right, the 28th chapter, and Allah says, وَجَعَلْنَاهُمْ أَئِمَّةً. We made them imams. Like, what does an imam do? Like, again, we tend to think imam in the normative context is like an upright, righteous person that leads prayer and is a good Muslim and on and on. But an imam is literally the one that stands in front and they lead. As Allah says, يَدْعُونَ, right? They what? يَدْعُونَ إِلَى النَّارِ. Where the Imam, Al-Imam Muslimi, right? The Muslim Imam, يَدْعُونَ inshallah إِلَى الْجَنَّةِ. But these people from Fir'aun, right, from Pharaoh, what he made them like that, to call people to the fire. So a narrative is always going to be calling you to something, and part of that will be, again, wanting you to have an emotional and psychological, if there is such a thing, association with that. And that's why I think, particularly for white Americans, the very concept of America is a narrative in a way that it is not for non-white people. Right? Meaning that we look at America through a lens that is not quite of the same level of narrative, especially no exceptional narrative, right? Certainly not through the American exceptional narrative.
Right. Right. And so, I mean, why do people follow? And we kind of talked about that, but people might follow the tyrannical narrative, and in this case, meaning the narrative coming from the tyrants, and we get wrapped up in it. But one of the factors was that there's this perceived strength, and they're charismatic. And we get into their narrative because we love to be associated with power, with this charisma, these leaders that can express themselves in such a way, and we're kind of connected with that. And because of social media playing such a huge part of our lives nowadays, we align very easily with what's said. So the power of speech It might be a Donald Trump.
Right.
And just, flagrant, just speech out there. You connect with that. And then he's associated with power and this brand and all this stuff. So you get wrapped up into it. And whoever it might be, he's just kind of the archetype of the day. But nevertheless, this projected strength, people get wrapped in it and then lose who they are in the story.
Mm-hmm.
And will compromise their morals or ethics.
Or more importantly, they imagine themselves now to be a part of the story,
living through.
Right, they're now embedded and immersed in the story.
Yes.
Right.
Well, and so the group identity too. Right now, I belong to the group, so
yes.
I'm part of this whole thing.
Yeah.
It's like so you're immersed in it,
especially for people in the modern context that I think are so cut adrift. I mean, I think. Today, where people are increasingly isolated, I think globalization has been, the kind of collision between capitalism and globalism, right? I mean, capitalism, we can talk about, maybe there are some expressions of it that, would be better or worse, but I think particularly capitalism and I would say almost like a kind of vulture capitalism marrying with globalization as a force, has had a devastating effect on particularly white America. Although King, like King said, if America gets a cold, then Black America gets like pneumonia, right? But I think that's where a lot of Trump has been as a person playing the puppet strings, realizes that there's a huge segment of America that has been alienated and devastated through that force. And he comes and manipulates that.
Yeah.
And we see it now, like in the UK, all these riots happening in the UK about all these immigrants, they're coming and taking our jobs,
Yeah.
And so I saw this one lady, she's actually, Black folks in the UK are a little bit different because they tend to know a bit more about where they came from than us in America. So they're either going to come from like the islands or like Jamaican or like West African. And she was like, what job are you imagining that some immigrant, whether they're a Pakistani immigrant, Jamaican immigrant, or West African immigrant, what job do you imagine that they are taking from you? Because your people have a history of you were just miners, you were digging in the dirt, you were laborers. What job did they come and take from you? Oh, you want to go work at the nail salon? Really, that's the job that they're taking from you, right? But again, the power of that narrative that they're coming over here and they're taking our jobs, just like in America. But she said, you know what? Why don't all of these, particularly these disenfranchised, angry white people, lower to middle, because upper middle class white people ain't really that mad about that much, because they got a parachute, they got a way out, and they're making money, right? But it's this angry, disgruntled, lower middle class, that's been sold this narrative that they're the ones that have been dispossessed and whatnot. And so she was just really highlighting. I might put it up in the show notes too, but there's a little bit of profanity in it. But profanity aside, she gives a really brilliant analysis. She's like, why did all of these Black and brown people come to the UK in the 20th century? One, because some of your granddaddies or some of your granddaddy's masters were involved in something called colonialism, right? So maybe if you'd stayed out of much of the Black and brown world, right, A, then people wouldn't have come here. B, they got you involved in World War I and World War II that devastated your country. And because so many of your own poor white people lost their lives, you had no choice but to bring in these people from throughout, right, the colonized world, the Black and brown world, to come to England to rebuild it. And they even got conscripted in your armies to fight your dumb wars, right? So he said, how do you think y'all even made it out of World War II? It's because you brought in over 1 million Indians. You brought in over 1 million Indians just as troops, let alone other parts of society. Yeah. And then when those people came, fought your war for you, now you're mad that they want a little bit of something in return?
Yeah.
Right? So, she had a great way of kind of laying out the, again, sort of rebuffing that standard narrative of they're taking our jobs. Like in America. either the jobs that are available, you're like either some like high level programmer, which again, Johnny Ray don't know how to do, right? Or you're not going to go compete with Don Pedro in the fields picking strawberries. You ain't doing that neither. So what job are they taking from you? But it's that narrative.
Yeah, let's throw that narrative out there. So, well, the point that that woman brought up in the UK, the historical narrative, right? And so predominantly our historical narrative, just keeps changing as needed in schools, or not even told no more, right? You don't even get the whole story anymore.
Right.
And so if we don't know historically, like you mentioned, who we are,
Yes.
then the story can be bought, sold, any story can be sold to you. And then manipulated that with like propaganda, as you mentioned, and then let's place that in a cultural context that fits what people want to hear. And then we got them again. So, the okie doke doesn't stop.
No.
The 1-2 punch, look left, look right, they just keep moving with the flow. And that's why what I was listening to one PhD, I won't call her a programmer, not even close to a programmer, a social engineering faction. But she was pretty honest. But maybe that was part of the psyop too, is her honesty. But the bottom line is,
you never know how to spin
you never
it,
know
man.
how to say it.
Yeah.
Like, just take it for a grain of the grain of salt. But she was saying, listen. They ask, well, what do you do anyways? Because you know a lot. You have a lot of historical information, and you can say things like, "Wow, it's amazing." She goes, "Well, the bottom line is what I do is I work with the team, and we are compartmentalized. What we get, the information we get, we don't know where it goes and who
Right.
it goes to, and that's the way it is. I can only tell you that. So if you ask me, who do I take orders from? I don't even know. I just know it needs to go to then this department within the government. Okay, so that's all I can tell you. But what I do is I scrub all of you guys' social media, and then we get a good echo chamber and a good swath of understanding what you guys think.
Yeah.
And the emotional factors out there from Facebook to Twitter, and then we can make decisions based off of what you guys are saying.
Yes.
And I found that very interesting. So again, they can create the narrative, what we need to hear, what we need to be told, right? So once they understood our cultural norms, then they know how to float the boat
Right.
and kind of maneuver you down the stream of their story. So the idea then is, well, how do we protect ourselves? Where in particular, yeah, Americans, people, humanity, but as Muslims as well, we say we have the truth. We claim we have this book that has it all. We believe in it. So why aren't we following it? And that becomes a question, an individual question everyone has to answer. But I think the easiest thing that you always teach, and I know, is you seek understanding and knowledge of your deen, starting with the true narrative of the Quran and what the Prophet ﷺ taught us, and then what was related back from the Sahaba.
And so then how do you do those, right? Because one thing to say, okay, you can only really know who you are by reading the Quran. But I think, the Quran doesn't only talk about reading, right? The Quran talks about, like, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, right? Read in the name of your Lord who created, or recite, because also really more in the context of the Quran, qara'a really means more to recite as an auditory thing than it is to read. But it can also obviously mean to read. But more importantly, Allah, when He speaks about the Quran and the Muslim or the believer's engagement with the message of the Quran, is tadabbur, right? Is to contemplate it deeply, right? And so the issue is that as long as Muslims continue to treat the Quran like a book of poetry, or a book that is like, like a book that is kind of like, in some ways, like any other book. You open the cover here and there. Once in a while, you take it out, almost like a recipe book. Like, oh yeah, like how do I make that kind of cake? And you did it right. That's not tadabbur. It's not reflecting on it. And so, one of the first things that stands out is, you know, truth, as the Quran says about itself, what al-haqqu min rabbik. Like the truth is from your Lord.
Yeah.
We don't have the truth. You know, we can say, oh, we have the truth as Muslims. No, we do not have the truth. The truth belongs to Allah Ta'ala, of which we can have access to it if we submit to Him and submit to the truth claims and follow its demonstration according to the Prophet ﷺ. But the truth belongs to Allah. The truth doesn't belong to any human being, right? Like that needs to be and that's a very important, in my opinion, very, very important distinction. Which means that then what we have to intimately to do to double. Why do we want to do deep contemplation of the Quran? As we've said before, when it comes to indoctrination, so we got all these words, you know, propaganda, narrative, indoctrination. The Quran also has the same objectives with the heart of a person. It wants to indoctrinate you into a certain belief. It wants to present to you stories, narratives, and it wants to propagate certain ideas. This is good, this is bad, this is permissible, this is impermissible, this is beautiful, this is ugly. So it really comes down to, who am I going to be? Am I going to go with the propagation of created things or the Creator? Do I trust Allah or do I trust Allah's creation? Especially to make up my mind as to who I am and as to what path I will lead in this life. You know, فَمَا اخْتَفَلْتُمْ فِيهِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ فَحُكْمُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ. Interesting verse in Surah Shura, the 42nd chapter of the Quran. As Allah says, right, and in the way that others have, you know, and if you differ about a thing, like ikhtilaf, we said before, like this weekend in the class, right? There's a difference between the term khilaf and ikhtilaf. The former, khilaf, is non-blameworthy decision-making that might result in a difference of opinion, but it's not blameworthy. And you can have cohesion and unity, and you're all generally a part of the same page. A simple example that many Muslims will know is there was a group of companions that were traveling, and the time for Asr came, and one group stopped and prayed, and the other group delayed, and when they went to talk to the Prophet ﷺ, both were correct. What is that? Khilaf. They differed, but an acceptable form of difference based upon deliberation. Then there's the type that is blameworthy that Allah refers to as ikhtilaf in the Quran, that He often applies to Bani Israel, right? And that they differed, especially even after knowledge came to them, because their hearts were not in the right place and they weren't willing to submit. If knowledge comes to you, but you're not going to submit to Allah Ta'ala, even though the knowledge has come to you, al-bayyinat, right? The solid proofs that the messenger brings you and their messengers brought and their prophets and whatnot, their scriptures, but your heart is still not inclined to submit to Allah, then it will actually cause blameworthy differences in schisms and splits. So Islam is unapologetic that Allah Ta'ala has plans and a design and an objective for the human being. مَا خَلَقْتَ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا لَاعِبِينَ. We did not create the heavens and the earth and everything in between it, meaning everyone in between it, لَاعِبِينَ, as either a jest or joke or with no serious design or intent. وَمَا خَلَقْنَاهُمَا إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ. We didn't create either of them and those and what in between, except in truth. Right? وَأَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. But most people, they don't grasp this. Why don't they grasp it? Because they don't contemplate it.
Yeah.
And so they're lazy in their engagement with Scripture, and they don't take enough time to deeply indoctrinate themselves in the truth of Islam. That's what you have to do. It's like, look, one way or another, my mind is going to be made up. My mind's going to either be made up by the libertarians, by the Republicans, by the Democrats, by the communists, by the conservatives, by the liberals, by the whoever. Somebody out there will definitely make up my mind for me. And if I think that I can have my mind unmade up, I'm fooling myself. Or my mind can be made up according to Islam. There's no, you have to pick and choose.
Yeah.
You have to pick and choose.
That for some people becomes the hard part because they didn't take the first step of that indoctrination of Islam. So
I've heard many Muslims say, like, I actually had a conversation with a guy. We were talking one day at dinner, a bunch of Muslims, and he was like, hey, what do you think about the concept of, Islamic schools? And I said, in theory, very much I support it. I said, now, if you mean like that particular school here or there or what, yeah, sure, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Many of them are not well ran, and okay, but as a concept, yeah, I absolutely. He's like, yeah, but if we send our kids to an Islamic school, that'll be like ghettoizing them, and that'll be putting them in a certain kind of box, and it'll indoctrinate them. Yeah, well, what do you think is going to happen if I send my kids to the kafir factory, the atheist factory, the LGBTQ factory, the hedonistic factory of public school? So I said, either way, you get it, man. Our kids are going to get indoctrinated.
Yeah.
Would I rather have my kid indoctrinated in Islam or in kufr?
Right.
No, again, I'm not selling Islamic schools like, oh, if you just put your kid in Islamic school, then it's like game, set, match, and that's it. No, obviously there has to still be a conversation of quality and capability. But I don't have any issue with indoctrination.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, I'm
pro-indoctrination.
I'm very pro-indoctrination, and I continue to indoctrinate and inoculate myself with that indoctrination, as a continuous process.
Yeah. 100%. Well, the idea here is understanding the narrative of control, in theory, could only be, to understand that is contrasting that. And so going back and studying your deen and understanding it, you can see through, as I said in the beginning, you can cut through the butter, man, and get to the guns. And you can understand that relationship of false and truth very easily. You're aware of that. The second thing to do is then the importance of self-awareness, right? And what are those Islamic values? Are we maintaining them? Are you having this kind of affirmation by reading the Quran and studying the life of the Prophet ﷺ and seeing, okay, where you're at? You have your GPS on through those sources. Also setting boundaries. And that becomes hard when you're living in this society. Maybe you're working, of course.
Well, we live in a very porous society where there's so many conduits to us.
Yes.
Of which then there will be many competing narratives. So I have my cell phone, I have social media, I have my laptop, I have my TV, I have movies, I have music. And so there's all of these conduits, Yes, there's so many. Yeah. We're so porous. Yeah. And that's why, Shaitan says, I will come at you from angles of which you cannot even see. And so then now, and this is why you see people that, how many of us have seen Muslims that go off to college that have not been successfully indoctrinated in Islam. Maybe they got dunked a little bit in the water, but they haven't really soaked and marinated in Islam. And then they go off to college and they take one class by some kafir professor in Platonism or biology, and all of a sudden they're an atheist.
Oh yeah, get tripped up.
There was a guy actually just recently in Twitter. He's over in the UK, and he was he was kind of lamenting about this phenomena of young Hufaz that had gone through this Alamiya program, this sort of program of like a seminary program, and they even completed their memorization of the Quran, and then a couple years into university, they all apostated.
Man.
They literally left Islam. And he's like, how can this happen? I'm like, indoctrination into the narrative of Islam is more than just memorizing the Quran, especially if you don't also know the Arabic language. Because then you're just memorizing sounds, and you're also going to memorize other people's creedal points, but you're not internalizing those themselves where, you know what, this is what I believe in.
Yeah. Yep. 100%. 100%. So, this episode was kind of the capstone of all of the last two, or about the last two. This will be the third capstone on.
This is our trilogy.
This is our trilogy.
Now we got to do the prequel. That's going to have a trilogy.
Man, we're doing postmodernism.
Yeah. Then we got to what comes after. What comes after the prequel, the sequel to the prequel to the prequel to the sequel.
And so if you go back in some of the episodes, you would kind of see how this would be
trying to tie some threads.
Yeah, this would be the end result, and the epitome of control is the narrative right now. I mean, literally, if you boil down what's happening throughout the West, particularly America, with the political scene right now, you name it, it's like who can control the narrative, the optics, will be in power. And by us handing over our power, that's what we got to be careful.
Yeah, because they, I know it's funny always to use that word, but right? Who is they, right? But they do need us in order to rule. They need our resource. I mean, it is very kind of like matrixy in a way of like, they need you to be that Duracell battery in a power plant, right? They need your money. They need your complacence. You need to be complicit and also to be docile, right? And just watch here's another season of, whatever. Just watch another season of this stupid thing or that stupid thing. Be distracted. Don't worry about these wars. We got that.
Yeah.
We'll
protect you.
Don't worry. Yeah, we'll exactly. America and freedom and eagles and flags, and don't worry about it. They have to assuage your conscience all the time and dope you up on all types of distractions so that you don't start to really think about everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I mean, imagine that. Imagine nobody voted. You know what? No one is even worthy of voting. So Americans just said, you know what? We're not going to vote this year because none of you are even worth it.
Well, that'd be some real.
I mean, they would flip out. They'd be like, "What do we do now?"
No, they'd be passing laws. You don't vote, you go to jail.
Yeah, by force, go.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the tyrants really come out.
Yeah, on one hand, they play that little game of, there's voter fraud and da 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 da, right? But that's all part of the game. That's like, it's like, the distracting the ref to hit the other guy with the steel chair. That's all part of the theatrics of it. Yeah. But let 2/3 of Americans just say, you know what, I had enough. I'm sitting it out.
Yeah.
Or let 2/3 of Americans say, you know what, I ain't paying no more taxes. Yes. I have absolutely had it with this fraudulent government that is just one war after another, inciting hatred of us around the world, as well as the complete collapse of all social services. I said, I ain't paying you no more. Let 2/3 of Americans do that. Then you'll see the tanks roll out, and then you'll see some stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And the mask comes off. So
it's about, like, who are you going to be? Myself, I've decided that I want to the best of my ability, I want to be deeply immersed in Islam.
Yes.
And I think that's part of the word Islam and the religion known as Islam, like ولكن المعنى الكلمة استسلام, right? The meaning of the word is like to submit.
Yeah.
So part of submission is I submit to the narrative of Islam.
Yes.
I submit to its truth claims. I submit to it, right? And I think once you do that, and then you internalize it as your own, it's like one of the Sahabi who initially, Abdullah ibn Samit, right? He was this interesting Sahabi who, when the Prophet first engaged with him, alayhi salam, at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, of the Sulh al-Hudaybiyah, he was actually on the side of the kuffar, of the non-Muslims. And he didn't really care for the Muslims too much. mainly because is that my son has disobeyed me, and as Arabs, we don't play this game.
Right.
Our sons,
There's a hierarchy.
There's a hierarchy, and now you've disrupted that hierarchy. So when they came time for, they were part of course, the treaty was that there would be an exchange of prisoners, and also a policy going forward that if the Muslims were to capture somebody from the other side, they would release them, but the other side didn't have the same obligation. Yeah. So they have to, turn over his son to him. When he saw the willingness of the Prophet ﷺ to, really be reasonable, that opened up a whole nother window inside his head of the possibility of him becoming Muslim. In other ways, he began to buy into the narrative of Islam, such that when the Prophet passed, when he passed away, there was a large contingent of the Hijaz. Several tribes are like, okay, Islam was all about Muhammad. Muhammad is dead. Man, we're just going to go back.
Right.
And so a lot of those Ridda war, like a lot of the conflict that came of people wanting to leave Islam after the death of the Prophet is also symbolic that they didn't wholly buy into the narrative. And they were like, oh, well, it's contingent upon him. Well, I guess I'll just go with some new contingency and come up with my own. The point is, Abdullah ibn Samit was like, no. I'm not fighting. When I go out and I fight them people for leaving, they're not going to pay zakah and not do this. No. I'm not fighting them on behalf of Muhammad ﷺ because he has passed away. Yeah. I'm fighting them because this is my religion now.
Yep.
And so,
taking that ownership.
The other thing is, like, I think the beauty about narrative, and again, you find even non-Muslim academics like, again, Walter Benjamin and others have written about this, about the power of narrative, is that it gives you ownership in something, right? And so I think especially as a convert, sometimes you come into Islam and it's like, oh man, these people have been Muslim since the time of the Sahaba, even though that may not necessarily be true in some of these people's family. But anyway, like their culture is Islam and they speak the language, and so I'm just this new kid on the block. Where for me, I was like, man, like I ain't gonna be a part of nothing unless I got to have some measure of ownership over this thing. And so that's why for me, I was like, well, one of the paths to ownership in Islam is to learn the Arabic language. I'm not saying that's the same for everybody, just in my case. And so by being able to engage the primary texts of Islam, obviously the Quran, and whatnot, it just gave me a sense of ownership, not necessarily entitlement, but ownership. Like I'm not doing this because I love Palestinians or Bangladeshis or Pakistanis or whatever. I mean, those are all wonderful people.
Married into it or something.
Right, or I didn't, no, I'm doing this because I'm all in. I've cashed in all my chips on this because it's what I intimately, believe to be, the truth. And so, and it's not a one-off process. Like I still, after all these 30 plus years, I find that Islam is an incredibly convincing narrative.
That's interesting you say that in regards to the ownership part. I never really looked at it like that. I just assumed it was just part of it very covertly, but now when you look at it like that, those who really engaged in it, my catalyst was I wanted to know why. Okay, well, why do we do this? Well, why do we do that? Right? So we all have this kind of like reason of going more depth into studying. Yours was the Arabic language. Mine was, well, I want to know the law of this, and why are we having to do that? And I didn't want to be empty. As like for a Christian, some people would ask me, well, why do you guys do that? I don't know. They just told me to do. The priest said you got to go do that. So that was the beautiful thing about Islam. Within the story, it told you the why and the how, for the most part, right? I really understood why the Prophet ﷺ did that. He explained, well, this is why we do that. And if it might have been just because you worship your Lord that way, okay, no problem. That's you said something.
Yes.
And so the mere fact of me engaging to such a degree, you're right. It was ownership. Now it became a part of me. I own it, and I'm with it. So yeah, that's interesting observation. I never really looked at it that way. And I think all Muslims, if you look at what part of ownership do you have in your Islam, it might bring some depth, to the quality and reignite your, la ilaha illallah,
right,
and get that going.
No,
interesting. You said it like that.
It's just, I was thinking about this quote from Egyptian scholar, a contemporary Egyptian scholar, Muhammad Abu Zahra, may Allah have mercy on him. And he wrote, talking about a particular field of study, usul al-fiqh, right, the foundations of the mechanics of the religion, right, the foundational principles of Islam, which is unfortunately a lot of people study fiqh, but they never get to the point of usul al-fiqh. And he said that usul al-fiqh هو من أجل العلوم وأبعدها أثرا في تكون العقل الفقهي. He said that usul al-fiqh, right, again, the study of the foundational principles of the religion is one of the most important sciences, one of the most sublime and important sciences, and also has the, as he says, his أبعدها أثرا, has the farthest reaching impact في تكون العقل الفقهي, in terms of the development of the juristic mind. And I think translating as juristic, like aqal fiqhi, what it really means is like a person that comprehends the religion. Usul al-fiqh is one of the most important sciences that will accomplish that. To what? That will deeply entrench the narrative of Islam in a person. Right? I thought that was like a really beautiful statement of his.
Profound. MashaAllah. So. Alhamdulillah. Well, any questions?
Oh, man, we didn't have any questions.
Okay.
We had a few comments. One person was like, he's like, if I have solar power, can I also enroll in the program?
Actually, yeah, you can.
Okay, good.
You might balance out because your solar power is going back on the grid, so you might not. You're probably already getting paid, maybe. But yeah, you can still sign up. Good question.
All right, man. The theme music is playing.
There we go.
Once it's playing.
Outro.
That's it. All right. Well, now our trilogy is over. We got to come up. We got to come up with something new for next week.
It'll come.
All right. Assalamu alaikum, folks.
Hey, I'm talking to you.